Hello and welcome to the School Safety Free Period podcast. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
And we are with the Educators School Safety Network. Welcome, and today we want to talk about our newly released report for the last school year, Violent Incidents and Threats in Schools. And this is research that we've been doing in different forms since about 2015, and then unfortunately we had to take a number of years as a hiatus because COVID-19.
And nobody was in school, or at least we didn't have a solid data set of everyone being back in school. So, yeah, that took some time.
And it's been unfortunate because there is really a demand for this type of research. And the reason that the research is so unique is it is so timely. So we understand sort of built into the methodology, and when you download the report, you can read more in depth about this. But there is the concern of, we are aggregating and we're bringing together media reports. So for any single thing that we're tracking, we know the problem is at least as bad as whatever we report, or at least as we should be at least as concerned as whatever we report, because we know that there's the very real possibility that there's underreporting built in here.
And that's consistently been true with whatever is the most prevalent thing happening, whatever the given year. That tends to be almost underreported just because there's so many of whatever the incident tends to be that sometimes they get lumped together. And we'll talk about that in a minute.
So do you have anything else you want to say, or should we hop right into the report?
No, I think we should kind of hop right in. And I guess that, there's some key findings and some big takeaways, but I think that, the methodology, as you mentioned, we need to not get too hung up on that in terms of, is this exactly an accurate number, but rather we really try to look at the trends more so than quibble about, is it this number or that number. We know that we can see the trends and the increases over time, especially when we're jumping from 2018, 2019 to 22, 23, that increase can look pretty dramatic.
Sure. So I think we want to probably talk quickly about our first key finding. The most frequent violent incident in the 22-23 school year was a false report of an active shooter, also known as swatting.
By a lot. And that's a statistical term, a lot.
And, if you were here, if you joined us for the last episode, we did a little preview talking about swatting specifically, and we are going to do an upcoming episode only about the concern of swatting. So if you want a real deep dive on that, you'll have to check out that past episode or an upcoming episode. But do you want to kind of talk about just kind of the high level points there?
Yeah, suffice it to say, about 64%, 63.8% of all of the violent incidents that occurred in a school in the 22-23 school year, 63.8% of them were a false report of an active shooter. These were still incidents because people had to respond. They believed for that time period that they were involved in an active shooter incident. So in 2018-19, that was a trend we were really seeing begin to accelerate. And then it really has just sort of exploded in the 22-23 school year. And this is one in particular that I think is really underreported, because we got to the point during the school year where the media was reporting that 10 districts had been impacted by swatting events. And you don't really know how many schools within each district, or they would say an entire region had swatting. Mm-hmm. And so you don't really know, but we really, so we tend to err on the cautionary side, but we know that, as you pointed out, it's at least this many, if not more. So the swatting thing, I think, is really going to be something we're going to need to watch moving into the new school year. Do we see that trend continuing? And in the special edition, when we talk specifically about swatting, we'll talk a little bit about the implications. We'll talk a little bit about why it's occurring. And then we'll talk about what we can do, because there are things that we can do. So swatting, if it's not on your radar now, it certainly should be.
Yeah, and in the previous episode, we talked a little bit about sort of postulating why is there such this large increase. You can see we're tracking a 546% increase from the 18-19 school year to the last school year. And then we talked, I think, pretty in depth about what can we do about it. What are the ways that educators can prepare, can have more tools in the toolbox to be able to address it. And then importantly, that sort of correlation of, swatting is effective because we're not prepared and our responses aren't great, so swatting works. And so if we're trying to put an end to swatting, being better prepared to respond and to be able to dial up our response. And we kind of talked about all of the kind of inherent struggles of educators in schools. You can't ignore this. You can't say, well, it's probably just a swatting attack. We have to respond because there's a period of time where people don't know whether it's swatting or whether there's really an incident. So I really encourage you to kind of hop back into that episode if that's something that you want to read more about.
I think one of the real tangible risks of swatting is that it sucks the oxygen out of the room, and it becomes a thing that we're obsessed about, understandably so because of the high rate. But it really, we need to not take our eye off the ball of some of the other findings in the report, because they also have really significant safety implications. So for example, gun-related violence continues to have a significant impact on schools. About 8.6% of all of the incidents involved a gun on campus, and about 7.9% of all the incidents were a shooting of some sort. Not necessarily the traditional active school shooter that we always fear and that we unfortunately have at too high of a rate, but in general. So this is looking at after school events or different times of the day where there are either shots fired, that's 1.4%, an actual shooting, 7.9%, or a gun found, 8.6%. And I think the shooting one is the one that we're always concerned about, not just from the stereotypical active shooter scenario, but from our sometimes lack of preparedness for a scuffle at a basketball game or in a parking lot that erupts into violence, and where a gun comes into play. So I think that is a big takeaway that shouldn't get obliterated or overshadowed by the swatting.
Yeah. And just kind of a housekeeping. So for the people who are joining us on YouTube, you're able to see the report here as we're talking about it. But for those of you who are listening to this as a podcast, go ahead and click on that link in the show notes, and you'll be able to download the report and kind of have a look at it as we're talking about. So we do have graphs and such to illustrate some of this data. So the third kind of big finding in the report this year is, as in prior years, schools also faced an array of different types of violent incidents in the 22-23 school year. So yes, gun-based violence is still a concern, and it's the thing that kind of takes up the most oxygen, as you kind of indicated before. But you can see here on some of these graphs that our educators are dealing with other incidents. So you have the gun-based incidents there on the top in green, but then in blue you have all types of other violence, other incidents spilling into the school, suspicious persons that necessitate a significant response in the school, fights and thwarted plots. And a note about fights, this is not like two seventh graders like shoving each other in a locker room. These are, I think, probably what would be more accurately characterized as brawls. Significant fights where you have so many people that it necessitates an outside law enforcement response typically. You'll also, do you want to say something about fights?
No, I wanted to kind of key in on the outside violence one, because that's kind of what jumped out to me as we looked at the data.
Yeah, well, before I get to that, let me just finish up here in this chart, and I'll scroll down and you can see the other part. The yellow there, you see the suspicious items, detonations, and explosive devices found. So there were 13 occasions where people were so concerned something was a bomb that they had to call in the bomb squad, and then 3 detonations in schools. I know when we were crunching the data on this, that was a surprise to me. Personally, I did not realize that there were 3 detonations in U.S. schools in the last school year. And again, these were not catastrophic with significant casualties, but they were still successful detonations of explosive devices in our schools. And so that risk of bomb threats, I think, is something that we can never put too far behind. And then also,
and that's a whole other conversation that I think we need to elevate at some point, because we know that there are ongoing threats and potential incidents that occur with explosive devices, and have been historically since we started looking at this data in 2013.
Yeah. And then finally, 11 instances where there was a knife found and 9 instances of stabbing. But I think here's what you kind of wanted to talk about, this potential correlation here between outside violence impacting schools at a higher rate at the same time that the reports of an intruder or suspicious person really dropped. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I don't know that, I don't want to get too overly excited about this and making this big tie-in when maybe it doesn't exist. But I think it certainly is a trend that bears watching, that we know anecdotally that over the past couple of years, we've been seeing more and more where outside violence or incidents or problems in the community or the neighborhood have spilled over into the school, because we know that's where, if you're looking, you're trying to, for example, find the kid that's bullying your kid, they're at school. You're trying to find the guy that you're angry with, he's a student, so he's in school. And so we're beginning to see more and more of where these outside violent events sort of spill over into the school. Mm-hmm. So the thing that was happening outside that had nothing to do with the school is suddenly entering the school or becoming a problem within the school. And then at the same time, we've seen this drop off. So we've seen that pretty big increase, less than 1% of incidents in 18-19, and now we're up to almost 5% mm-hmm. of incidents in 22-23. But then at the same time, you have this drop off in reports of intruders or suspicious persons. So I don't think it's likely that we suddenly don't have any intruders, because clearly we do, because we've got this increase in people intruding into the school. But we have a decrease or a drop in the rate in which it's being reported. So I think that's kind of an interesting notion that may have some tie back to the pandemic, when we didn't have people coming into the school. And so we weren't really worried or thinking too much about visitor screening or visitor engagement or access control, because either the school wasn't even open or nobody else was coming in. And so now I think this might be a little bit of a learning curve or a catch up of what are we doing to make sure we have good access control, that we're screening visitors, that we're engaging with people, and that we're not allowing outside problems to barge into our classrooms or into our schools. And that's also a little bit of a training issue in terms of, we know that teachers and school staff members get lots of training in active shooter, but we also know they don't get very much training in de-escalation, in how to deal with physically aggressive people. And we saw that in 18-19 as well, where we had high rates of violent physical aggressiveness that did not involve a firearm, and that people really struggled to know what to do with that and how to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that actually ties really, really well into this sort of fourth big finding, that the particular challenges for schools moving into 23-24, because we have sort of both things are true. So we have, on one hand, actual school shootings is relatively low, right? It's only 7.9% of the violent incidents that we track. But at the same time, schools have this incident with, swatting, where schools are forced to respond. And there's a period that you have to respond as if there is an active shooter. And I think it's important to kind of draw attention to the fact that, we show this pie chart here where only 7.9% of the violent incidents are active shooter. That pie chart does not incorporate all of the other types of risks and hazards that schools might face. This is only violent incidents tracked. So we're not
man-made violent incidents.
Right. So we're not contemplating accidents, medical emergencies, significant severe weather, and all of those other types of risks and hazards. And so it kind of comes back to this foundational concern that we always have. We have to have a plan to respond to that worst case scenario, active shooter, even if it turns out it was only swatting. But on the other hand, it can't take up all of our time and energy and effort, because then we're turning a blind eye to all of the other risks and hazards. And so, the way that we always kind of advocate is to think about building the skills and capabilities that would be helpful in a worst case scenario, active shooter, but that are also skills and capabilities that our faculty and staff, and in a developmentally appropriate way, our students need to have. So communication plans, that's the one that I feel like I always talk about. Having good communication plans and capabilities is helpful in a worst case scenario, this 7.9%, but having good capabilities for communication is helpful if we have a medical emergency or if, straight line winds rip the roof off of our building. Do you want to speak to any of that?
Well, I think that that's a really important point about the man-made violent events versus accidents, medical emergencies, weather events. That's one of the weaknesses in the ability to collect data on those things is we don't know the rate of accidents and medical emergencies per se nationally. But I think it's also creates kind of a little bit of that conundrum of, wow, we know that swatting occurs and we know that there's violent and aggressive behavior and we know there's active shooters. So that's what we're going to focus on. But anecdotally, any of our listeners know, if they've been in a school for more than 5 minutes, that you're going to have a high rate of accidents and medical emergencies. When you put 800 kids together, you're going to have higher rates of accidents than you might in a different kind of scenario or situation. So I think it really speaks to that need for being able to walk and chew gum at the same time, being able to look at both how we are responding to violent events, how we are responding to those almost inevitable things, severe weather, medical, that kind of thing. We cannot just be prepared to do one but not the other.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, we had some grad students do some pilot research that I think would be really interesting to pick back up, where they asked sitting administrators, in the last school year, did you experience any of these incidents? And they had a whole list, and it included active shooter, gun found, violence, like what we track in this report. But then it also had accidents, medical emergencies, weather incidents, all, flooding, infrastructure failure, all of the other things. And in that pilot research, 0 of the administrators who replied said that they had experienced an active shooter. And 100% of the administrators checked some other box, that they had experienced some other thing. And it maybe was something quite low level, a medical emergency that was not that significant, but every administrator had experienced some type of crisis, and none of them in that research that year experienced a school shooting. So I think it's really important to put that in context.
And then when you push that up against, if you ask a follow-up question of what training have you received, a disproportionate number of them are going to say, if I've had any training at all, it's been in active shooter, not in these things that I just faced last year. So I think that's really crucial too, as a training piece as we move forward, of are you training people for the things they are going to face, or are you just training people for the thing you fear the most?
Let me tell you, Dr. Klinger, you are getting right to the next point of this report. It's almost like you wrote it and you know what comes next. So we want to talk about some of the recommendations that we make. And the first one is training resources and emergency planning for schools need to focus on an all hazards approach to school safety. And that's kind of the drum that we beat all of the time. But when you look at the things that people actually face and you look at kind of the limited scope of training that they actually get, this need really comes into sharp focus. And one thing that we really always advocate for is shifting to a skills-based approach to training and professional development. So instead of thinking, what are all the awful bad things that could happen and how would I respond? Instead, to shift that thinking of, what are all of the things that I need to be able to do, and not focus quite so much on why would I be doing those things, but instead the capabilities that I need to be able to have.
Well, I want to do a little bit. I want to talk about one that we don't typically talk about as much, because you've already talked about communication. We've talked about, active shooter response. We've talked about the need to understand that there's more to it than that. But in the report, we alluded just briefly, and I think this is something we'll probably be exploring in subsequent podcasts. We really need to look at, in 22-23, how do we begin to, as we go into a new school year, 23-24, how do we begin to rebuild those trust and interpersonal relationships that are kind of intangible? We can't measure them per se, but we know that they have an impact on the perception of safety, on disclosures, on the level of support that people have for the school. So how do we go back and start and try to rebuild some of the fractures in the trust between the home and the school and students and the relationships between students and their teachers and other people in the school. So I think, while that seems like sort of the soft side of school safety, the relationship piece is, I think, one of the pieces where schools are really hurting and really they need to turn their attention to that, particularly in regards to safety and in regards to a collaborative approach to these issues.
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the third recommendation. Responding to incidents is critical, but the impact of false reports, the impact of swatting on student safety and academic achievement, we have to recognize it. And I think swatting is kind of the big thing contemplated in this research. But what you kind of alluded to of that fracture in trust, the breakdown in relationships. And I think, obviously schools are in a tough position coming back from COVID and all of the things that had to be restarted. But I think we still need to make sure that we're allocating enough time and attention to rebuilding those relationships. I mean, between faculty and staff, but also with students and with parents and with other stakeholders as well.
Yeah, and it's tough. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this, but I think part of the reason that we keep having to have these conversations every year and we keep having these reports that show these increases is because schools tend to just focus on one thing instead of really taking the comprehensive approach that you've talked about, where we're looking at prevention as well as response, where we're looking at stuff as well as relationships. So I think until we get to that more comprehensive approach, we're going to continue to see alarming numbers like this.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to add about the report?
No, I think, it would be a good thing to take a look at. I think, disseminating it to folks is probably helpful in terms of, your administrators or your leaders or, if you're a parent, the leaders in your school. I think building awareness of what we're up against is really a significant part of that first continuous improvement.
Yeah, so we'll have, more information. I think we'll probably take a deeper dive into some of the stuff about swatting specifically moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those recommendations in terms of mitigation, in terms of training, and in terms of approach. Kind of we will get
more specific about those because it sounds very self-serving to just go build relationships, but there are really specific strategies that you can do to do that. And we'll be talking about some of those. And then I think also stay tuned for later in the fall as the school year gets underway. I'm very interested to keep an eye on the rate of these kind of events and what does it look like when we compare the fall of 22 to the fall of 23. And that may help us to predict some of the trends you're going to be dealing with in this upcoming school year.
So there's that's the serious part of the podcast. And now you reach the part where it's the school safety free period. What do you have funny or fun to tell us? It doesn't have to be about school safety, but inquiring mind wants to know, what do you have fun or funny?
What do I have fun or fun? I don't know. I had to sort of snicker at our definition of fighting. There is nothing more amusing, unfortunately, than the seventh grade, please stop me from fighting each other, that when we have seventh grade boys. But, it is also, not to get too serious, we also have to acknowledge that, these kind of incidents that are happening, they do escalate. When you're looking at, for good or for bad, you look at the ridiculousness that's happening in your society and the really awesome things that are happening in your society, they're going to spill over into schools. So I guess it's not particularly funny, but I guess the good news is if we improve our society and our culture, we're going to improve our schools. So hopefully that's kind of a uplifting way to end it.
Yeah, I mean, this is not fun or funny either, but I think, there's been a very famously videoed of a brawl going around on all social media. And I think now would be a good opportunity to talk about, you as an adult have the opportunity to model the behavior to students that you don't have to film whatever is happening. You don't have to be a part of it in that way. And to be able to model the behavior of, like, I can remove myself from a situation, I can just opt out of a situation. If opting out means I'm not filming it, I'm not posting it to social media, Obviously, our students are hearing very, very strong cultural messages that if something's happening, you need to either get involved physically or get involved videoing wise. And I don't think that we can underestimate the impact of you all as trusted, competent adults to model a positive alternative.
That's a really good point. How many times as young parents do you go, where did they learn that? Well, they learned it from you.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking in horror at 16-year-olds, where did they learn to do that? Why would they do that? Well, they learned it from us. So
yeah. I don't know that I have anything else fun or funny. So
well, I think the report's a lot to digest. So I think that right there, the only, I guess, the wrap up on the report is, let's always keep in mind as we look at these figures that there is so much that we can do. This is not just looking at a death spiral and going, there's nothing we can do. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. There's a lot that we can do. Yeah. So this is not a report that is just admiring the problem. It's a report that hopefully is resetting people in a post-pandemic world to start doing the many things that we know we can do to reverse these trends.
And I will come up with something fun and funny for next time.
Okay, pressure's on.
I'll get something prepared. Well, you too. I can't only be the funny one. You have to.
I can be spontaneously funny. I don't need to plan for it.
As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email us info@eschoolsafety.org. You can find us on social media, and most importantly, you can find this podcast, the report, and all kinds of other free resources on our website, www.eschoolsafety.org. And until next time, stay safe out there, and we'll be back soon. Thanks.
See you soon.